Guys, it's Courtney, and today I am going to be creating a one-layer scene with Piece of Cake and Sweet Treats stamp sets by Honeybee Stamps. So I have a bunch of masks pre-cut, and a lot of people ask me about my process for building a scene. So we're going to build a scene together. I'm not going to cut any of this out, and we're going to kind of walk through it together. So I have an idea in my head. I do not sketch out my scenes first. However, that's not a bad idea. I just don't take the time to do so. Now you can certainly use a MISTI, but I'm just going to be using acrylic blocks to kind of piece together my scenes. For this particular one, I'm not going to draw in anything. I am just using my stamped images. I'm working on a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm going to be stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. Of course, we're going to be doing Copic coloring. All of my masks are pre-cut with Simon Says stamp masking paper. And as I'm stamping, I'm going to be stamping whatever little pieces of candy and strawberries and everything else that's in front of another first. And then I'll go ahead and mask those out and move on to kind of the next layer or the next row of goodies. So you can see that I have the masks cut out for that large cupcake that will be on kind of that serving plate, I guess you could call it. And that's going to be kind of behind some of the pieces of candy, but it's so big that it's going to be up front and center anyway. But I wanted a few pieces of those candy to look like it's in front of that little pedestal. So I stamped and masked those first. And this cake pop off to the left-hand side is going to be in front of other things as well. So that's a pretty large image. So you may want to think about stamping that first, or at least getting the placement in your head first before stamping everything else out. Now, once I got a few pieces of those candies stamped and masked out, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the cupcake. Now, there's different layers to this. There is the plate, the cupcake wrapper, the cupcake and the frosting, and then there's going to be a cherry on top. So I'm going to go ahead and take my masks and I'm going to lay them all out exactly the way I want them. And then I'm going to start stamping from the top to the bottom. So it's going to be exactly opposite of what you would think it would be. Because I want this little cherry to be on top of the frosting, I want this to be stamped and masked first. And then I'll stamp the frosting, then the cupcake, then the plate. So you see how that goes. So a lot of times when you're building a scene, you want to kind of think of things opposite of what you would think you would be stamping. So you would think that everything towards the back would be stamped first. Just think it's going to be the opposite. So same thing for this. Now, when I went ahead and stamped out the cupcake part or the wrapper part, it does easily line up, or let me rephrase that. You would think it would line up pretty easily as far as stamping it out, but I did a horrible job stamping. You guys think I'm a pro with the acrylic block? Not all the time. So when I stamped this out, it was a little bit crooked, but that's okay. I can fix that. All that really means is that the lines for the frosting don't match up with the lines of the cupcake wrapper, but we'll fix that later. So you can see that I'm masking as I go along. So each little piece that I stamp, I'm going to mask before I move on to the next one. So once the cupcake was done, I'm just going to kind of fill in some of these random areas on my little table there. And I don't know whether you guys noticed, because I know I didn't mention it. I did take my T-square ruler, you can use any straight edge, and a pencil, and kind of just drew a diagonal line. And that's going to be the back of my table. And I just drew that in as a guide so that I knew exactly where I needed to stamp my images. You don't necessarily need to do that. You can always draw it in later. But for me, that makes it a little bit easier, so I know exactly where I'm stamping what. So I'm also going to take one of the strawberry stamps from the Piece of Cake stamp set and kind of fill in some areas there. And in the end, I ended up stamping a couple of the cherries as well, just to kind of fill in some blank areas that weren't quite big enough for the little pieces of candy, but needed something. And you'll see that I ended up adding 2 more later on as well. So you'll notice as I go along here, there are going to be a couple of the pieces of candy that I don't end up masking out, or I should say the strawberries and the cherries I don't really mask out. Because these are sitting on the table, there's nothing that's going to be in front of it or in back of it, and nothing is kind of overlapping the table. So some of the back pieces are kind of hanging off of that, or I should say stamped beyond that pencil line. And I'm going to be doing ink blending in the background. So I'm going to mask those out, but anything below that pencil line, I'm not worried about it as long as I'm not stamping directly over it, if that makes any sense. So once all of the stamping and the masking was complete, this little gap that I have between the frosting and the cupcake wrapper, because I can't stamp, I'm going to go ahead and fill those little pieces in with a ripped up piece of Post-it note tape. You can use any kind of mask here. You can use a regular Post-it note. You can use washi tape, whatever you have on your desk, just so that my ink doesn't get in that little gap between the two masks. I'm also going to draw a straight line right over that pencil line with an EK Success Journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen. And then I'm going to mask directly on top of that line with some more Post-it note tape. I added 2 just in case my ink blending brush goes beyond that. I've had that happen and it's frustrating, so I added another piece. I am going to be using just one color of Distress ink here. You can certainly do any kind of crazy background that you want, but I want my background to be fairly subtle. So I am taking a Blending Buddy brush. This is by Trinity Stamps, and I am starting directly on my strips of Post-it note tape, which is basically masking out my table. And that's going to be the area that I add the most color or the most intensity of color. But you can see that I'm just kind of building up my color gradually. I want this to sort of fade out to white as I move to the top of the card panel. And in order to do that, you want to make sure that you're not adding too much ink at one time and you're kind of just gradually building that up. So once I was happy with that coverage, I can go ahead and remove all of my masks. Now, I have nail polish on, and this is just regular old nail polish. It's not gel polish or anything. So I am going to use the tip of my scissors to remove these masks. Had I added more Distress Oxide ink than I did, I probably would have given it a minute or two to let that ink dry before removing my masks. But being I just added a light layer, I'm good to remove them right away. And now you can see that our scene is kind of coming to life now. I did also take that EK Success Journaling pen just to finish off those little lines on either side of that cupcake to make it look a little bit more seamless. And I also went ahead and went directly over the stems of the cherries in the back because the Distress, I'm having a hard time talking today. The Distress Oxide is opaque. It kind of tones down that black outline, so you may have to go over certain areas with your pen. So we're going to move on to the coloring. Oh yeah, erase those pencil lines. Now we're going to move on to the coloring. So I wanted to kind of show you, I'm using only a few different color combinations for this entire card, and I'm going to kind of show you that you can use the same color combination and get different results. So first I'm going to bring in my warm grays. I was going to do this with cool grays, but decided I'm going to be using the cool grays for everything white. So I decided to switch over to some warm grays for the table. I prefer to do my background first. This is completely personal preference. I prefer to do this first because I can go directly over my images. Especially once I move down to the W1. It's such a light color that I can color directly over it. And if I wait to color all my images and then do my background, I run the risk of accidentally touching one of those pink or red areas or even brown areas and dragging that to areas that I don't want it to be. Remember, the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender and drag and move color in places we don't want it. So I added a little bit of W5 to the back portion of the table and created a shadow under every single thing. And this is what's really going to ground your images too. If you're not comfortable with shadows, you can certainly skip it, but that will give you a little bit more of a scene look just by grounding each one of those images. Went ahead and blended that out with the W3, and you can see that I'm blending out each of those shadows under each one of those images. And then I can move on to the W1, which is a fairly light color. And you'll see that as I blend this area out, I am not being careful at all. I'm not trying to be super careful going around my images. I'm not going over them on purpose, but I'm not worried about it if I do, because it's so easy to cover being at such a light color. Now, this is a larger area that I am covering, so you may have to go over certain areas more than once if you're getting a streaky look that alcohol markers sometimes give us. So next we're going to bring out those cool gray markers, and there are some images here that I want to look gray, and there's some images that I want to look white, but I'm going to use the cool grays for all of them. So for this cupcake wrapper, I want it to look white. I am just going to add my shadow. So I'm starting with the C5, and I'm just really adding a shadow where the wrapper is kind of indented in and out of the cupcake. And I'm just drawing straight lines. I'm going to extend that a little bit out with the C3 and then a little bit out with the C1. And you'll notice that I'm still leaving white space. Every white object is still going to have white space, but it's also going to have shadows. And that's what's going to give you the depth and dimension. So I'm also going to use this same color combination with the exception of a scary dark. I'm going to bring in a C7 for this little serving plate, pedestal, whatever you want to call it. And I'm just going to add a little bit of shading on either side because we're just keeping a center light source for everything here because we're going to make this nice and simple. And I added a little bit of shadow underneath the plate portion and underneath the cupcake itself. Now, when I add my shadows off to the right-hand side, you can see that I added a little bit of a gap there. And that's just going to act as a highlight. It's like the light is shining on it or something like that. And it really doesn't matter what side you put it on if we're working with a center light source, because we're going to be inconsistent with this entire card. So I'm going to extend these areas out with the same colors I used for the cupcake wrapper, except for this time I'm not leaving any white space at all. And you can see that even though we use the same colors, they look completely different. And now I did color the little wrappers of those two candies with the same color combination as the cupcake wrapper so that they will appear white as well. And for these little candies here, they look like gumdrops to me, so that's how I'm coloring them using the same colors, the C5, the C3, and the C1, just adding a little bit of shading to either side. These are round objects, so we want a strong center highlight. And to get rid of that difference between the C1 and the white paper, I quickly go over that white area with a colorless blender. So now moving on to the E50 markers, I'm going to color the cake portion of my cupcake, and I want this to be chocolate. So I started with my lightest color to get the paper saturated. Going to add a little bit of shading on either side of the cupcake. Again, this is a round object, and just a tiny bit of a shadow underneath the frosting. I'm going to blend that out with the E57, then the E55, and leaving that center for the highlight of that E53. And you'll see that this gives you a lot of dimension, and it's super easy to do. So I'm going to use this same color combination for this candy right here. And again, I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to either side. And you can see that I'm just adding a little bit of that E59. And the amount of color that the amount I'm using for each of the colors is about the same for this particular one. Now we're going to move on to another candy, and I'm going to use the same color combination, but this time you'll see that I'm going to add a whole lot of that E59 and then just a little bit of each of the remaining three colors. And you'll notice that this gives it a completely different look. You still have a strong highlight, but it makes it look maybe like dark chocolate instead of milk chocolate. So next we are going to move on to this striped candy, and I want this to be every other stripe will be the chocolate. So again, going to work on a center light source here. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to every other stripe on either side. Blend that out each and every time and keep the center of each one of those stripes for that E53. We're going to bring in a pink combination for the remaining stripes later on. I'm keeping my pinks and reds till last, which is something I definitely recommend you do. They end up in places they shouldn't end up whenever you start with them. So next I'm going to move on to a different brown combination here. It's not too far off from the E50s, but just to kind of show you the difference here. And I'm going to color this one the same way as I did for the others. And I'm sort of being careful not to go over these little dots or sprinkles or whatever they're supposed to be, but not a huge deal if you accidentally go over them. But I am kind of sort of being careful. Now for this cake pop, I'm going to color this with the same color combination, and my highlight will still be in the center, but because this is laying down, my highlight is going to be a little bit more towards the top instead of dead center. But I'm coloring this the same way, and this time I'm going directly over these sprinkles, and you'll see why later when we bring out the white gel pen. So once all of that was done, I can go ahead and bring in my pinks and my reds. First, I lie. We're going to color the little leaves and the stem of the strawberries with just a 2-color combination because these are pretty small areas. Now we're going to bring in the pinks and reds. I'm going to start off with the red combination. And again, I'm going to use the same combination for the strawberry as I am for the cherry. So I'm going to pretty much do my shading the same way. It's not any crazy techniques that I'm doing here, but I'm starting off with my lightest color, getting that paper saturated, going in with that scary dark, then the midtones, then back to the lightest color. And you'll see that I didn't use a whole lot of the scary dark for this one. Now, when I move on to the cherries, I'm going to do the same thing as I did for that dark chocolate piece of candy and add a whole lot of the scary dark color, and then just a little bit of the 2 midtones and the lightest color. And you'll see that even though we use the same reds, it does look a little bit different than that strawberry. So I went ahead and colored all the other cherries and the strawberry same way as I did for the first 2. Now we're going to bring in the pinks. So I have 5 different markers here. For these striped candies, I am going to leave out the scary dark, and I'm just going to use the 4-color combination, starting with the RV09, finishing off with the RV02 for the center. And once this is all colored, you'll see that it really gives it shape by keeping that center highlight. Now for the sprinkles on this one, I'm going to bring that RV09 and I'm just going to fill in those sprinkles, and you can see that even if you accidentally went over them, more than likely that will cover it up. Now moving on to the frosting. I'm going to start with my lightest color here, and I'm going to map out those darkest areas. And the darkest areas are pretty much going to be where one layer of frosting overlaps another. You know how you kind of, with a piping bag, if you've ever decorated cupcakes before, you go around in a circle. And as you go up, the one layer is overlapping the layer before it. So now I'm going to bring in that scary, scary dark RV69. And I'm just going to add a little bit of a shadow where the darkest areas will be. And you can see that I'm just using the tip of my marker here. You can see my marker is straight up and down, and that's how you're going to be able to get into those tiny areas. A lot of people have a hard time with Copic markers. They're a brush nib. How to get into those small areas. It's practice, but I'm barely touching the paper here. Also keep in mind that alcohol ink, no matter what alcohol ink it is, spreads. That's what it does. That's why they blend so well. So as soon as you touch that paper, even though you probably wouldn't be able to notice it, it is spreading just a tiny bit. So just keep that in mind. The later you touch the paper, the less it's actually going to spread. So you can see that I'm just finishing off here with the RV04, and I'm leaving a very small highlight, but even in those small areas, I'm leaving just a little area for that highlight color, and that's what's really going to give you that dimension and shine to the frosting. So next I am going to go ahead and color in the trim, I guess you could call it, for the plate that the cupcake is on. And this time I'm bringing in an R80 combination. I'm not going to do a ton of shading on this because most of it is blocked, but I am going to add a little bit of shading on each side and between each little one of those little sections on the bottom for the, it kind of looks like a lacy trim on the top. These are tiny. Again, I'm just putting one tiny little dot with just the tip of my marker, keeping in mind that it could spread a little bit. So add less rather than add more. I always think of it that way. So once all of my coloring was complete, We're going to go ahead and add all of the details now. So I fixed up this little coloring error with my white gel pen. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill in these little sprinkles, these white sprinkles with my white gel pen, the ones I colored directly over. Then I can also add highlights to every single thing. You just want to make sure that you're going in the same shape of the object. So these little candies are kind of rounded on the top. My highlight will be round, and then I can add a straight one as it goes straight down. So as long as you're going with the shape of the object, it's really going to boost up your coloring. Your coloring does not have to be perfect. If you add this white gel pen detail or this white gel pen highlight, I promise that you'll be much happier with the results. So next I'm going to go ahead and move on to the sentiments. So I'm taking 2 of the sentiments from the Sweet Treats stamp set. I'm going to go ahead and line those up onto my work surface here to make sure they're straight. Pop those onto an acrylic block, and I am not as brave as you think I am after doing all this coloring. I did go ahead and stamp this onto that same scrap piece of paper I used for my ink blending, just to make sure it was completely straight onto my acrylic block before stamping that onto my card. And I stamped this out with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. It's a fast drying pigment ink, but it's not immediate, so just be super careful. Next, I went ahead and added some shimmer to some kind of random pieces of candy and the frosting with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen. And for these little gumdrops, or the things that I'm calling gumdrops, I am taking some Glitter Nouveau drops. This is the Blizzard, White Blizzard or something like that. And they're just clear with sparkles. And just kind of going directly over my little gumdrops, and this will look like the sugar. So that is it for me today. I hope you found this video helpful. As always, I'll leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.